The dawn broke like liquid gold, spilling over glass towers, yet within the high walls of the royal palace, the morning felt like a sentence passed. Every bell that rang echoed not with celebration, but with warning. The corridors shimmered with silk and obedience. Their beauty sharpened into chains. Today was meant to be the day of unity, her union with a prince she scarcely knew. But the air tasted of captivity. Beneath the polished perfection of her world, something trembled. A thought too dangerous to speak aloud. As servants moved with reverent precision and courtiers rehearsed smiles of duty, she felt the weight of eyes that measured, molded, owned. Beyond the open balcony, clouds gathered like distant conspirators, whispering of rain, of freedom. The first gust of wind brushed her cheek like a secret invitation, and for the first time, she dared to listen. The bells of union tolled, each note reverberating through corridors lined with gold and ghosts. The palace transformed into a theater of perfection. Every servant rehearsed, every guest adorned, every glance measured. Yet beneath the lace and laughter, unease coiled like smoke. The princess's heart beat out of time with the music. When she moved, it was as though she were dancing not toward her destiny, but away from it. Every mirror she passed seemed to whisper a different reflection, one of wild rivers, unbound hair, and sky. Even as her mother's gentle hand guided her toward the ceremonial doors, she felt the world narrowing to a single question she could not yet voice. What if obedience is the slowest form of death? As the doors of the throne hall opened, silence fell like a blade. The prince waited at the far end, bathed in a shaft of sunlight that seemed too sharp for comfort. Every step she took toward him echoed louder than the next, until her pulse drowned out the music. The crown above the dais glimmered, a symbol of everything she had been raised to revere and everything she now longed to escape. When she reached the center of the hall, she felt the wind. Yes, the wind, slipping through the cracks of the stained glass behind her, carrying whispers of rain from the distant storm. The priest's voice began its measured chant, words older than kingdoms. Around her, the air thickened with expectation. But the princess's mind drifted, beyond the walls, past the city gates, into the unknown places her tutors had forbidden her to imagine. She thought of the horizon she had only seen from the highest tower. She thought of wind unclaimed by royal decree. And then, as thunder murmured closer, she felt the strange certainty that every story of freedom begins with the smallest betrayal of silence. And in that suspended instant, before vows were spoken, before history repeated, she lifted her eyes to the storm outside. Lightning flared through stained glass, painting her in fractured color. The hall gasped as she stepped back, her veil slipping from her hair like a falling petal. Her mother's cry echoed her name, but the princess did not look back. She turned toward the open balcony where the thunder waited, and for the first time her heart matched the rhythm of the world beyond the walls. The storm had not yet passed, but its echo lingered in the silence that followed her refusal. The grand hall, once heavy with ceremony, now hung suspended between awe and outrage. Guards hesitated, courtiers whispered, and the queen's command trembled in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Yet the princess felt lighter than she ever had. She stood in the ruins of expectation, the scent of rain and fear mingling in the marble corridors. Outside, thunder receded, as if the heavens themselves had paused to listen. The world had shifted, and though she did not yet know where her feet would carry her, she knew one truth with blazing clarity. She had begun a war, not of nations, but of will. The queen's words were measured and cold, yet each syllable carried a tremor she could not disguise. Punishment was promised. Exile whispered between clenched teeth. But beneath the queen's wrath lay something more fragile. A memory of her own youth, long buried beneath layers of protocol. The princess stood still, refusing apology. She had not betrayed her crown. She had merely refused to let it cage her. As thunder rolled beyond the palace walls, the court held its breath. No decree could silence what had been unleashed. The spark of rebellion that once lit could never again be extinguished. Night fell heavy upon the palace, draping every corridor in morning gold. The servants moved in silence, fearful of the queen's temper and the whispers of a cursed defiance. Yet, somewhere within that labyrinth of marble and velvet, the princess found her first taste of courage in solitude. She wandered the forgotten West Wing, where portraits of past monarchs hung like stern ghosts, and paused before one that seemed to breathe. A woman in armor, eyes bright with defiance, stared back at her from centuries ago. For the first time, Alara understood. The desire for freedom was not rebellion, it was inheritance. At dawn, the queen summoned her council. Their voices clashed like iron, demanding control, restitution, silence. But beyond their gilded arguments, the queen's mind drifted to her daughter's eyes. The same eyes that once looked upon the world as endless possibility. Outside, banners hung limp in the cold morning wind. Inside, decree after decree was drafted, yet none could undo the moment when the princess had chosen herself. The kingdom trembled, sensing that the law of obedience had been fractured. The first crack had appeared in the crown, and through it, light began to leak. When night returned, the princess stole once more to her balcony, where the storm had cleansed the air. Below, the world stretched wide and unknowable, painted in moonlight and shadow. The gardens whispered with wind through wet leaves. Somewhere beyond the walls, the road awaited. Her hand brushed the stone balustrade, tracing ancient carvings of wings. For the first time she smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. Tomorrow, she would find the hidden passage that led beyond the palace grounds. Tomorrow, she would breathe as herself. The night of her escape began without ceremony. No farewell, no witness, only the breath of the wind against stone. The palace slept, wrapped in layers of obedience and silence. She moved through the corridors like a memory slipping from history's grasp. Each footstep echoed with the rhythm of her heartbeat, fragile but resolute. The storm had passed, leaving the air drenched in the scent of wet marble and roses. When she reached the hidden servant's stair, she looked back once, not at her mother's tower, but at the world that had once called her its possession. Then, without a word, she stepped into the dark, the first free step of her life trembling beneath her feet, like a promise newly born. The hidden passage beneath the palace smelled of earth and forgotten time. Roots twisted through the walls like the veins of the past, and her breath clouded in the chill. The lantern sputtered, its flames struggling against damp air. Each step forward carried her farther from the life written for her, and closer to the unknown she had always imagined. She wondered if freedom was supposed to feel this heavy, this frightening. But as the first thread of dawn crept through the cracks above, her fear softened. For even the smallest light, she realized, can unmake a kingdom of shadows. She emerged into a forest still veiled in mist. The world beyond the palace felt vast, untamed, alive, indifferent. Each sound, the whisper of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, seemed to welcome her and warn her all at once. She pressed forward, shoes sinking into damp soil, cloak clinging to her shoulders. For the first time, the sky stretched unobstructed above her. It wasn't the painted ceiling of a hall. It was endless. She tilted her face toward the wind, eyes closing as though greeting an old friend. The silence she had once feared now sang with the pulse of possibility. Hours passed as she walked deeper into the woods. Hunger whispered. Fatigue clung, but wonder kept her moving. The forest seemed to shift with her, paths folding and unfolding like dreams. When the sun finally rose, she found a clearing by a stream and knelt to drink, watching her reflection tremble across the rippling surface. The face staring back was hers, and not hers. The princess of gold and ceremony was gone. In her place stood something wilder, freer, unclaimed. She smiled faintly, though her hands trembled. For the first time she belonged to herself, and that frightened her more than any crown ever had. As the sun climbed higher, she heard movement beyond the trees. A footstep, cautious yet deliberate. She froze, hand drifting toward the dagger she had taken from a guard's belt during her escape. From the mist stepped a traveler, cloaked in weather-worn leather, his face shadowed beneath a hood. He did not bow or address her as royalty. His gaze met hers as one human meeting another. For the first time in her life, she was not seen as a title. He asked her name, voice low and steady. She hesitated, then spoke, not the name written in royal lineage, but the one she chose for herself. And in that moment, freedom gained its first witness. The forest deepened into a realm untouched by time. Days bled into nights, and still they wandered, following the murmur of rivers that led nowhere and everywhere. The wanderer spoke little, yet his silence carried more comfort than any promise of safety. Together they crossed valleys veiled in mist and fields jeweled with dew, until the air itself began to shimmer with something unearthly. The trees parted to reveal a vast lake, its surface so still it seemed to hold the sky captive. The water mirrored every cloud, every star, every heartbeat. The princess felt it before she saw it. An ancient pull, as if the lake had been waiting for her since the first breath she ever drew. The wanderer spoke of legends whispered through generations, of the mirror lake that revealed one's truest self, not as the world saw them, but as they truly were. The princess knelt by the shore, her reflection shifting, becoming fluid, alive. She saw herself crowned, chained, adored, forgotten. And then none of those things. Beneath the surface flickered faces she had never known, women who had walked away from thrones, who had chosen wind over gold. The lake shimmered like liquid memory, and within its depths she recognized something terrifyingly beautiful. The woman she was becoming. From the heart of the lake came a voice, not heard, but felt. The surface rippled, and the mist coalesced into form. A figure robed in light, neither young nor old, neither man nor woman. The oracle of the lake regarded her with eyes that contained constellations. "Oh, you have broken chains," the voice whispered, "but not yet your own reflection." The princess's heart trembled as she gazed into the oracle's luminous face. In its gaze she saw her fears, her mother's sorrow, her longing for love unshaped by duty. To be free, she would have to forgive the cage that raised her, and herself for stepping out of it too late. Tears welled unbidden as the oracle's words echoed through her. "Freedom demands truth," it said. "Will you bear it?" She nodded, though her voice failed. The lake's surface broke, revealing visions of what could have been. A life of comfort, devotion, children who bore her name, a crown heavy but secure. Then the image dissolved into wind and silence. When she looked again, the oracle was gone, the mist retreating across the surface like a sigh. She stood alone, trembling but unbroken. The reflection that stared back no longer frightened her. It bowed to her, as though recognizing its queen. When she finally turned away from the lake, the world seemed sharper, more real. The wind hummed softly through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of rain and rebirth. Kale waited in silence, understanding without words that she had crossed an invisible threshold. The girl who had fled a palace no longer existed. In her place walked a woman who had seen herself stripped of illusion and survived it. She glanced back once more, the lake now still, reflecting only the open sky, and smiled. The journey was not over, but for the first time she knew where it must lead. Forward. In the kingdom she left behind, silence had become the loudest rebellion. The court whispered of curses, omens, and betrayal. Yet the truth was simpler. A woman had chosen herself. Amid this turmoil, the prince wandered through the corridors once meant to welcome his bride. Her absence clung to every tapestry, every candle flame. He had not expected to miss her, yet something in her defiance haunted him. A courage he did not possess, but longed to understand. When the queen summoned him, her command was wrapped in duty, but steeped in grief. "Find her," she said. Not for love, for the kingdom, but in his heart, he knew he sought not a fugitive, but the part of himself she had awakened. He left at dawn, his horse's hooves echoing down the cobbled path like a drum beat of inevitability. The world beyond the walls smelled of rain and unspoken stories. He followed rumors of a cloaked woman seen by the river, of laughter among the trees, of footprints leading west. Yet as the road unwound, duty loosened its grip, replaced by a deeper, quieter calling. He began to see the kingdom as she might have, its beauty tarnished by rules, its peace purchased with silence. And for the first time, he felt the weight, not of command, but of conscience. Days turned into restless nights beneath cold stars. He found no trace of her, yet her presence lingered in every whisper of wind. At an old inn along the border, he heard stories told in hushed tones of a girl with eyes like sunlight on water, who spoke of freedom as though it were a birthright. The prince smiled despite himself, recognizing her even in strangers' descriptions. He began to realize that she had not merely fled a life, she had begun to rewrite it, and without meaning to, she had invited him into her unwritten chapter. Beyond the inn, the land unfurled into wild meadows and mountain passes. The prince rode through tempests and sunbursts alike, his heart torn between loyalty and longing. When he finally reached the border of the Forbidden Wood, a hush fell over the air. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. He dismounted and stepped into the twilight between worlds, one of duty behind him, one of destiny ahead. Somewhere beyond the veil of leaves, he sensed her presence. The forest did not frighten him, it beckoned. And there, among the whispering trees, he saw her. Just for an instant. At the far edge of a clearing, her cloak rippling like smoke against the fading light, she turned, eyes meeting his across the distance, surprise and recognition colliding like thunder and dawn. No words passed between them, but the silence was electric, alive with all that had been unsaid. In that fleeting moment, neither was prince nor fugitive. They were two souls, standing at the crossroads of fate. Then she turned away, vanishing into the forest, and he followed, not to claim, but to understand. The forest held its breath as two destinies crossed paths once more. The prince approached through shadow and silence, no longer a hunter but a seeker. She turned to face him, not as the princess he once knew, but as a woman shaped by wind and distance. Between them lay 1,000 unspoken truths, the vows unmade, the chains undone. "You should not have followed," she whispered, yet her voice carried no anger. He met her gaze and smiled faintly, as if understanding that what he sought was never possession but forgiveness. Around them the woods stirred. Leaves quivered like pages of a story rewriting itself. And from that trembling stillness, choice emerged. Hers, his, and the world's. They spoke quietly beside the dying fire. He confessed that he had not come to reclaim her, but to understand what had driven her beyond the gates. His words trembled with honesty. The first she had heard from a royal mouth. She told him of the lake, of the oracle, of the reflection that had taught her the truth of freedom. "It isn't rebellion," she said softly. "It's remembering what we were before we were told." The prince stared into the flames, his own reflection bending and breaking within them. When dawn touched the horizon, she stood and turned toward the distant palace. "I must go back," she said, "not to return, but to end it." The return to the kingdom was unlike her departure. She rode not in secrecy, but in certainty, her heart steady as the horizon opened before her. The prince followed at a distance, his silence a vow of protection, not command. When the palace spires rose through the dawn haze, the city stirred in disbelief. Word spread like wildfire. The runaway princess had returned. Yet, there was no fear in her, only purpose. She would no longer flee. She would face the crown that had caged generations and name the truth it had hidden. That obedience without love was not loyalty, but loss. In the great hall, thunder gathered once more, not from the sky, but from hearts awakening. The queen sat upon her throne, regal and unbending, yet her eyes betrayed the weight of waiting. The princess entered, her steps unhurried, each echo a declaration. The courtiers murmured, unsure whether to kneel or condemn. "Mother," she began, her voice steady as steel, wrapped in silk, "I have not come to obey, nor to defy. I have come to choose." The queen rose slowly, gaze locking with her daughter's. "And what choice is left?" she whispered. "The one you never took," Elara replied. Lightning shattered the sky as words long buried broke free. The queen's anger fell away like armor too heavy to bear, replaced by grief that trembled at the edges of love. She saw at last in her daughter not rebellion, but redemption. The crown slipped from her fingers and rolled down the marble steps, coming to rest at Elara's feet. The thunder outside quieted, as though the world itself had exhaled. The princess knelt, not to submit, but to lift her mother's hand. "We are both free now," she whispered. And as the wind swept through the hall, the torches flickered and the centuries of silence finally broke. The storm had passed, leaving the kingdom bathed in a fragile golden silence. The courtiers dispersed like ghosts released from duty, and dawn poured through the shattered glass, scattering light across the marble floor. The queen stood beside her daughter, the space between them now bridged, not by blood, but by understanding. Outside, the bells that once tolled for obedience rang again, this time for awakening. The world did not end when a princess refused her crown. It began anew. And in that beginning, Elara felt the first true peace of her life, not in possession, not in promise, but in becoming. The prince remained a quiet witness to transformation. He stood among the people as the news spread, no longer a suitor, no longer a savior, but a man learning the language of humility. He saw how her courage had rippled outward, softening hearts hardened by centuries of command. The queen decreed no punishment, no exile. Instead, she opened the palace gates. The people stepped forward to see the woman who had dared to choose herself. In their eyes, she saw not rebellion, but recognition. Freedom, she realized, was not escape. It was contagion. That night, beneath an open sky, she gathered the people in the courtyard once used for coronations. No scepter, no throne, only her voice carried by the wind. "I am not your queen," she said, "for no one should rule where hearts are meant to bloom." The crowd stood silent, then bowed, not in submission, but in respect, for she had given them what no ruler ever had, the permission to dream without fear, and though her journey was not over, she knew the kingdom had already changed. Freedom was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. When the stars crowned the sky, she stood once more on the balcony where her story had begun. The wind lifted her hair as if in benediction. Behind her, the queen slept peacefully for the first time in years. Below, the prince prepared to depart, his journey unfinished but reborn. She looked to the horizon that had once frightened her, and saw it for what it truly was, endless possibility. She did not need a kingdom to feel powerful, nor love to feel whole. Freedom was not something she carried. It was something she had become. At dawn, she rode beyond the city gates, the world opening before her like a promise fulfilled. The sky blazed with gold and violet, vast and alive. The prince's shadow faded behind her. The queen's love remained unspoken yet eternal, and the whispers of her people followed like a blessing carried by the wind. She did not look back. Freedom was not behind her, nor ahead. It lived within her, fierce and infinite. And so the princess who refused to marry the prince became more than legend. She became the wind itself, untamed, unnowned, eternal.